Okay, so Dan, thank you for taking the time to talk to me and the students at the University of Waterloo today. What we're going to talk about, I think, is very valuable. We're focusing on quality and how organizations manage that. And of course, your expertise in this area is deep and valuable. So I thought we'd start by me asking you to talk about your role now as Director of Quality Tools and Technology at Estee Lauder, and how your career took you to where you are now.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. First of all, thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate that, and getting a chance to talk to the students here also. So, I think when you get out there, you find, I'm sure you've seen the same thing, Peter. There's a lot of twists and turns in everyone's career, right? So it's not necessarily a straight path. You find the things you like and you adapt to those over time. And I think that adaptability to change is kind of an important part that you'll find in life and in your career. So for me, I started out with in mechanical engineering from the University of Pittsburgh, went and worked in the automotive industry and in quality and process improvement areas, which was a lot of fun. Started my own engineering consulting business. Then I moved into technology and software companies about 15 years ago, or sorry, make that about 20 years ago. I spent about 15 of those last 20 years at software companies, kind of taking on different roles and really looking for the most I could get out of each one of those opportunities. And got myself eventually where I was running the business unit effectively the business unit for quality at a big tech company out of Boston. So working on building enterprise quality management software. My team did that, and we worked on IoT and smart connected quality. So did a lot of the early work on those items, and then spent about 4 years as a research analyst at a analyst firm focused on industrial transformation. And there was a lot of fun. I got to coin, the term quality 4.0 and talk about how industry should approach it and work with a lot of the software developers on how they should be approaching quality and the market, as well as working with manufacturers on this stuff. So it was a lot of fun. But I saw this opportunity at Estee Lauder, and it's really it's a great company, and it's an interesting one because I get a chance to really put a lot of that work with software companies and as a research analyst into practice and helping Estee Lauder in its transformation journey. A lot of companies are in the middle of that right now. So it's been a lot of different things you kind of hear in there, some pretty hardcore engineering, which I really enjoyed a lot, software stuff and analysts and building some thought leadership. And now where I'm at today, where I'm really be able to get some hands-on on the transformation part of this.
Exciting. And so, as you've said, much of your career has been focused on the management of quality.
Yeah.
And so for the people who are watching, some of them might not be that familiar with what quality management is. So could you provide just an outline to give them a foundation to think about?
Yeah, absolutely. So good question. Quality management is very broad. And actually one place to start is, what is quality itself, right? So a lot of times you look at a product, you're like, yeah, this is a quality product or not. Well, one of the quality gurus of the last 30 years is Philip Crosby, and he defined quality as, and you know him, he defined quality as conformance to customer requirements, right? And I agree with that. And I'd also say that in today's world, it's so interesting because quality, lots of things are changing, right? Supply chain's changing, product development's changing. Well, quality's changing too. And one of the big drivers for quality is the fact that there is now a digital voice of the customer and the digital voice of the consumer, right? So if you look at social media and you look at the online marketplaces, there's this digital feed of quality information there. If you think about quality management, it really starts from the voice of the customer, right? If you look at that, the quality function deployment, you look at all these different pieces that start with the house of quality and the voice of the customer. Well, now we have a digital voice of the customer. We can do digital benchmarking effectively and start getting that insight in terms of what the customers really want and how that flows down into the product and how we're actually achieving that in the marketplace. So, there's a lot of opportunity for us to redefine that. So I'd take Philip Crosby's definition, which I think is right, but then also expand upon that and say, now I think what quality really is conformance to customer expectations. Because in my case, it's not just the explicitly written requirements. It's the fact that when you use your iPhone and then you go into your vehicle and you've got a navigation system, you expect that same level ease of use in the navigation system, and that might dictate which vehicle you buy. So right there, we kind of hit a bunch of different topics, but in general, quality management is something that is really at the high end, at a high level, is all the processes and procedures and documentation and behaviors that you use to instill quality in your product. Got to understand what you mean by quality, but that's how you build that into your product. And it starts from the beginning of the process, works through how you plan, do product development, how you plan for production, how you get into distribution, and your service with the customer. It's really that whole flow. So it's a fun time to be in quality because a lot of this stuff is changing, and we can actually kind of write some of the rules if you're in a spot where you can make some decisions around that.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that quality is really all of the things that you do to make sure that the organization's work meets the expectations of the customer.
Yeah.
With those expectations coming from the definition that Crosby came up with.
Yeah.
Okay. So my next question then is, in trying to do this, what are the main challenges that you think organizations are facing in achieving this?
Yeah. So when I was at LNS Research, I did a lot of primary market research in exactly this problem, right? And one of the things that we identify time and time again is that a lot of the issues are related to the inability to effectively measure quality, so metrics, ineffective metrics, and some challenges around like lack of timeliness of metrics, right? And then, cross-functional responsibility for quality. We just talked about, what is quality, right? It's this big thing. It's not the responsibility of just one department. Really, it's got to be embedded throughout the organization. And so that becomes a big cultural piece, but also the processes side. And then another big challenge is that there's a lack of a consistent quality technology architecture. And so the specific questions we would ask were around things do you have, is one of your challenges that you have too many quality systems? And I'd say in practice, most companies have many, many dozens of systems. And some of those things are paper and some of them are spreadsheets, right? There's a lot of spreadsheets. And now there's, the new version of spreadsheets, which is SharePoint, right? So you do that piece, right? It's a little bit better, but it's still quite informal in a lot of cases. And you're missing that architecture. So ultimately, all the other stuff, to me, kind of comes back to that. One person I'm a huge fan of is, and he's no longer with us, but John Boyd, who was the father of the F-16 and the OODA loop, so observe, orient, decide, act, right? There's, and a number of other things. Pretty influential person in military strategy, but also a lot of his strategies have been implemented by business. And I leveraged that when I was building out what I was calling the digital innovation cycle for quality. But one of his tenets is that companies or the people actually want to work in a collaborative fashion. But if there's obstacles in collaboration, then it becomes a competition, right? And that's where, because now you're like, I need to still complete what I want to do, but I can't because something's in the way of that, me being able to complete it. So think in terms of, hey, I'm a product development person. I have a need to launch a lot of new products in a given time frame. I want to embed quality into that process. I'd really like to, but how do I get access to the data and insights to drive that in, right? If I need to go and find the specific person who might not even be at my location anymore because of globalization, right, that knows what I need to find out, how do I pull that information in? That's a roadblock that prevents us. So all these other challenges around culture, et cetera, I think at least in part have a role in technology. So for your students, I think one thing that's really valuable is think about the process side, but also become a student of technology, because technology and digital, digitization, et cetera, is a driving force. It's changing how we behave. And if you don't have the fundamentals in place, then you create competition, which prevents you from, in the case of quality, for instance, really embedding that throughout the life cycle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as you've been saying that, I've been thinking about my understanding of what Deming, W. Edwards Deming, had to say about management of people in quality, where he said, that it was about enabling people to produce quality because most of them wanted to do that. You've qualified that a little bit by saying it's about enabling people to collaborate to achieve quality,
Yeah.
which I think is a very interesting addition to what Deming had to say, and very important. It seems very sensible what you're saying,
Yeah.
that would be the case. Yeah, very interesting.
Excellent.
Okay, so the next, you've written about the importance of a business case for quality, presumably ensuring that the quality activity is aligned with the priorities of the business. But can you talk about that? Why is the business case important, and what do you mean by that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. If you look at it, I mean, let's go back to that last conversation we just had about on technology, right? Well, one of our problems is that the quality profession has had um, a challenge getting the funding it needs, right? And that comes back to business cases. I mean, it's not, if you look at R&D in a lot of cases or supply chain, often it's easier to find funding sources there than necessarily from a quality perspective. And in part, everybody, first of all, everybody will say how important quality is to their products and how important it is to their customer. Well, what's that mean, right? Um, so we all know it's important, but how do you actually quantify it? Are you basically, if you go through from a lean perspective, right? In lean, there's value added activities, right? And you invest in those value added activities because you want to make sure that you're doing more of those things because they're adding value. Then there's non-value added activities. And out of non-value added activities, you can break that into two pieces. The one piece is that if it's a required non-value added, and that's compliance, and there's non-required non-value added. So a lot of words there, right? But if you look at it, let's break this thing down, right? If value added is you're making a high value product that you can sell, and you're making more money and more profit out of it. That's a great example. Now, the second piece would be if you're looking at compliance related stuff. Well, on the compliance stuff, if it's non-value but required, non-value added but required, you're going to make the minimum investment that you have to. You'll make sure you're compliant, right? But you're going to have the minimum investment to that piece. And the last piece is the non-required, non-value added, and you eliminate those things. You should. Those are all your mutas and wastes. So you get rid of those things out of your process. So the challenge is that in a lot of cases, quality is talked about their value in terms of compliance. And that'll only get you so far. You actually have to make the connection between quality activities and operational and financial performance. And that's where I've done a lot of work at LNS Research and quantifying that and also talking about how there's a roadmap to it. You don't want to have a single point investment. You want to be able to have a roadmap where you can continue to make investment over time and improve your capabilities. So that research I felt was pretty foundational in terms of talking about those pieces. One other driver for that is that if you look at organizations in general, and this could be related to quality, it could be related to environment, health, and safety, or supply chain, whatever it is. When we have an escape, we have a major problem. That's often when we make investment. Well, to protect your company, you don't want to wait until you have a quality escape to make an investment in technology. You want to be able to drive that based on value, not based off of a negative, compelling event, right? And so that's another key piece of this business case.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned quality. We'll talk about that in a second. I thought that we should probably just help the students to understand your work as an industry analyst. So you've been an industry analyst in quality management and operational excellence. You've referred to lean, an important part of operational excellence. But can you tell students what an industry analyst does? Maybe give them a broad understanding of operational excellence and what you see as the main trends in industry around quality today.
Okay, good. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I think so. First of all, the industry analyst thing, a lot of people have a hard time understanding what that is. It's a little bit of a unique job. In a lot of cases, if you're a technology analyst, right? You have some background in the subject matter you're talking about. You also understand technology, for instance. And what you're doing is you're kind of meeting in the middle between the companies that are building the technology and the manufacturers, right? So you're kind of in the service providers. You're meeting in the middle between them, so you can really understand. Okay, guide the technology providers in terms of how to satisfy the market, and then also guide the market in terms of what are the most recent trends and how should they adopt it and what's the implication for them around that technology. So there's a little bit of a kind of a consulting portion to that, but there's also the idea of building thought leadership, which is a kind of a self-aggrandizing term, right? But it is, the idea of saying, okay, we've taken these ideas and we're going to go maybe move them forward a step. And here's how to consume the idea of, let's say, for instance, applying digital transformation to quality. Here's the framework, and here's what that framework means and how you apply it, as an example. So that's what a research analyst does. It takes a lot of these changes. We know that technology is not slowing down anytime soon, so you takes that stuff and basically use it. You build out a perspective there. And then in terms of operational excellence, is at one level it's how do you improve your people, process, and technology. So there's a people aspect, so that's the behaviors, competencies, etc., and culture. The process aspect, so how do you execute your core processes, etc., and then the technology side. And so how do you optimize across those three things to improve outcomes and reduce waste? One of the things that people often fail when they're working through technology, for instance, and I think there's another good thing for the students, is that I think there's two behaviors. You asked about some of the trends, Peter, and I'd say that some of the trends that are alive and well, that are actually negative trends, are that for a long time there's been silos, and you and I talked about this in a precursor to this conversation, but there's a lot of silos out there, right? And there's where silos are different functions or sites behaving independently, right, without sharing best practices. And it may be connecting together in a meaningful process. And there's also this challenge around, if a new technology comes out, let's chase that technology. Maybe it's difficult for people sometimes to connect that to actually to meaningful, sustainable business value, right? So those are two trends I think that are fairly alive and well. And if you look from a student's perspective, when you go out there in the market, you might not have all the expertise in terms of your future employers' manufacturing processes and supply chain, right? But you do have a knowledge of you're new and you're bringing in new outside ideas. And secondly, you've got a pretty good handle on technology compared to some of the folks who have been out in the market for a long time. So if you want to make a difference, one way that you can have an impact will be to really look at those silos. When you look at implementing technology, you might get pulled into some digital transformation initiatives. Almost all companies are working through digital transformation right now. It's such a broad spectrum. Many companies working from many different angles, supply chain for sure, quality also, manufacturing. You'll get tied in those projects, but if you can work your way through and make sure you're helping, transformation isn't just applying the technology. A big part of it is also making sure you break down those silos and improve the processes. If you don't go through the work, the pre-work, to understand here's how we do it today, the way I approach this stuff all the time is you come in and capture as-is state from the multiple stakeholders' perspective and by site, say here's how you work it, here's how we do it today. Now let's look at how we standardize or harmonize that process, where harmonization is flexible unification and standardizing is saying we're all going to do it the same way. Let's work our way through that and define what a standardized / harmonized process is and how we can technology optimize that process. And if you work that into it, now you actually say, okay, based on this new technology, here's the impact that'll have on our competencies and people. Here's how it'll impact our processes, and that'll drive the outcomes. Everyone's working through digital transformation today. There's a lot of big items that are changing industry. We talked about, social media and the digital voice of the customer, online sales channels. That's going to be huge for us going forward for everyone, right? Increasingly important. All those different things, that all has this digital thread that runs through it. And so everyone's reacting to that digital thread. But those who, in my opinion, are going to react best to it are going to be those who really think through that work up front, and especially for large companies, get everyone working off the same sheet of music, break down these silos, and really have, apply technology for maximum business benefit.
Yeah, very interesting. And when you talked about the job of an analyst, it seems more important today, given the rapidly changing world and the rapidly changing technologies, and the fear that a lot of companies have about committing to a particular technology or direction without feeling confident that this is the right thing for them to do. Yeah. But also then you moved on to talk about the need for integration as part of digital transformation, which I think is exceptionally important in terms of understanding how everything fits together and having a consistent approach to that. So, so these, I think, are things that are very, very important.
That's a key point, Peter. And I think one of the things that we saw at LNS as well was that just across industry, there's a risk of people creating new digital silos. They already had silos, they didn't transform, and so they got new digital silos. So again, for a young professional getting out there, thinking through how to break through those silos. Anytime you walk in, start thinking cross-functionally and try to break it down and understand who all the actors and players are, even if they don't necessarily walk up and announce themselves that, hey, I'm a part of this process. Do that digging and figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see the same need in a lot of companies I work with too. You've talked about the impact of technology quite a bit already. I was keen. I know your role in Quality 4.0, but I did want you perhaps to explain what that specifically is in terms of the use of technology from a quality point of view.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so Quality 4.0 is actually a pretty broad topic, just like quality is. But what we're really talking about is the digital transformation of quality. So it's that can kind of vary depending upon where you're at in the supply chain, right? The technologies that actually come to bear there, right? Like for instance, if you are a consumer-facing company, you do have visibility into social media information, which is a great it's a source of insights, but also something you have to be cautious about because you can see some brand damage from it as well. But you have that piece. You've got the online marketplace information, which is extremely valuable, etc. So those are input feeds you have if you're at the OEM level and going into the consumer-facing part of the supply chain. If you're down the supply chain a bit, it can be a little bit. You don't have necessarily that digital voice of the customer as clearly, right? So you've got to maybe do some more work to dig into that. But regardless of where you're at, there's some consistent technologies, for instance, like things like data lake and predictive and prescriptive analytics, and now especially in the future, in COVID, a lot of the technology for like mobility and virtual workforce and augmented reality and virtual reality, a lot of these different technologies come to bear. But back to our earlier conversation, it's people, process, technology. And that's why when I defined that Quality 4.0 wheel, there was the piece of it, the overall framework that guides it. There was a piece that was talking about the technology side, the metrics that you're implementing, but also a lot there around leadership and culture. How does leadership change with the new digital data? How do you share leadership? Again, something like quality, it's cross-functional. How do we make sure that other leaders have a degree of responsibility for quality, right? How do we, basically build in the culture into this stuff? And then again, flowing from a process perspective, like we've talked about already, I think fairly well. But that's overall, to me, Quality 4.0 has technology enablers. Of course, those are the things that are enabling it, right? Without it, it's not digital transformation, because the digital element's quite important. But the transformation part doesn't necessarily come from the technology. It comes from the other pieces, the process and people side.
Absolutely. And accepting that, I did want to talk a little bit about what the technologies are that are available to organizations today. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the aspects of those that organizations should be aware of as they think about using them. And the role of a quality IT leader. How does a leader make this happen?
Yeah, really, really good question there, Peter. So if you look at from a technology side, I mentioned a few that apply pretty much across the board. If you look at data lakes, for instance, so many companies have data lake projects where you're really consolidating a lot of this, a lot of data, so you can drive insights, right? And it lets you connect between different sources of data. So it could be from, again, social media and online marketplace information where you have a lot of unstructured data, to areas where you've got semi-structured, where you've tagged it, or if you've got structured data like coming out of an ERP system, for instance, or EQMS. But it lets you combine all that stuff together and then start applying a analytics layer on top of that. So if you're looking at machine learning and artificial intelligence, but realistically, with some of that data, your companies have probably already undermined it. They haven't mined it sufficiently, I should say, not undermined it. They haven't mined it sufficiently. So if you look at that, there's opportunities to use traditional business intelligence and statistics and analytics that might actually provide some quick wins there, just because of access to data and reduction in latency and insights, right? So there's with all this stuff, just taking that one little microcosm of the data lake and the analytics, there's always a roadmap that and a journey to all these things. And everyone talks about journeys, and it's because it's real, right? Once you get that information, if you can reduce the latency and provide, find your opportunities to provide the initial low-hanging fruit from business intelligence, then you can say, okay, we're already pulling some value from this stuff. And at the same time, now let's build on our strengths to start looking at predictive things like predictive, a lot of the companies in food and beverage, for instance, have been working toward predictive manufacturing bill of materials, right? They have natural variation of incoming ingredients. So basic, because a lot of those ingredients are raw materials and farmed products, etc. And there's natural incoming variation. And based off of that stuff, make it a smart bill of materials that reduces their rework and their mutas and wastes, right? So that's one piece of it. And it's a hot item. If you're out there looking for opportunities, there's a lot of opportunities around analytics out there. But there's also a lot of fundamentals around enterprise systems. And if you look at it, my prior LNS Research's statistics on this show that EQMS is still only adopted by the low 20 percentile in the marketplace. And environmental health and safety system, EQMS being an enterprise quality management software. So that's like your centralized hub for your quality technology and processes. Pretty low adoption rate. And again, we said earlier, lots of fragmentation in quality and in quality technology. And if you look at the EHS side, it's a similar challenge on environmental health and safety. So there's a lot of these sort of fundamental technology or process areas that cross different areas are missing the core enterprise tech stacks to support them. And that's where, so you still need to have some of that stuff in place. It's not simply that you jump into, let's look at IoT, let's look at augmented reality, right, in virtual worker and connected worker opportunities. There's tactical benefits to be gained from things like worker sensors, right, in augmented and virtual reality. But let's take an example there. If you're some of the benefits cited by companies who have adopted augmented reality are that they improve worker training, right? They improve the agility of bringing on new workers into a workforce. They can scale them up more quickly, and thus they can adapt to new changes in production or, shifting production between different facilities much more quickly. That's true. But all that stuff gets fed by a training management system with a role-based training, right? If you don't have that training management system and the role-based training in place, then you don't have a structured way of feeding that information down to the augmented reality technology. I'm hoping that makes sense. But you need to have that enterprise process framework in place, and then you can feed from that into the specific technology stacks that can virtualize that technology. And I think that's where a quality technology leader comes in, and as well as other technology leaders in other areas, is someone who understands the subject matter. So understanding the process scope and how you should optimize that, as well as the technologies. You can build out this roadmap. So when you look to implement a certain benefit, you say, okay, for me to get from point A to point D, here's the steps in the middle, right? And here's how we build out that overall architecture that's going to help us connect all the dots in our enterprise.
So what you seem to be saying is that organizations have a lot of data now that they're not using, that there could be a lot of benefits from that data if it can be accessed more quickly and with the capability to process it. And then the use of tools like VR and AR is there to take advantage of the knowledge that comes from that in the training and guidance of the workers who would be responsible for implementing the improvements that come from that knowledge. Is that a summary of what you're saying?
I think it's a lot of it, Peter. I think one of the things that I also feel in addition to that, though, is that we actually have a lot of data that should be structured and should be built into an enterprise architecture and data model that is not. Right? I think that's one of the challenges the industry has. If you go back to that initial comment I was saying that we've got dozens, companies out there in general have dozens, if not hundreds of different systems to track quality, for instance, and spreadsheets, etc. All that stuff means that that's quote unquote data, but it's not actually something that you can action and connect into a digital technology like augmented reality. Actually have to take a step back a little bit and say, well, what do we need to have in this case? Well, we need to have something that's called training matrices, which are a role-based training, right? Here for a given role, here's all the stuff they need to know. If you're managing that in spreadsheets, it gets difficult for you to connect the dots on that stuff. So I think that's another piece. One piece is we aren't actioning on the data, but the other piece is a lot of our data isn't structured the way it should be. And so you have to think through those pieces too.
So if all that information about the variable quality of the things that are coming from a farm or somewhere else, if that's being held in a spreadsheet somewhere, it's hard to get that into the VR and AR.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, makes total sense to me, and certainly I can understand that type of difficulty. So you've started to talk, and you've talked at various points as we've been talking about the people aspects of managing quality. We've talked about the technology. Now we're moving on to the people. How important is a quality culture? And how can organizations achieve what they need to achieve with people to effectively manage quality today?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, if you look at, obviously culture is really critical. It's one of the key elements there in the transformation of quality, but really just of quality in general. So obviously critical. If you look at it again, quality's got to be everyone's responsibility. It can't be limited to the quality or QA department. It's really got to be something that's kind of crosses, and just in the same way, by the way, is safety. If you look out there, there's a culture of safety. There's a lot of initiatives underway because everyone understands that can't be owned. Safety can't be owned by the safety department. Workers in operation, etc., and distribution centers, all that stuff. They need to be aware of safety and working their way toward that. So a lot of similarities. So critical. Ways that we can get there, again, removing a lot of these obstacles. We've talked about the obstacles a bit. And again, the more we can contextualize data, so once we can kind of work our way through, build a centralized, if a company's built out a centralized framework, they can start building toward having, these enterprise, having an enterprise system in place to manage their processes consistently. They take data from off of the individual users' desktops or in local siloed centers, bring that to a centralized location so it's actionable by the organization. Now that lets you start implementing, effectively implementing things like, augmented reality, like we were talking about, the use of mobile apps effectively, etc.
Yeah, makes sense. And we've talked about people and technology. I thought we should probably also talk about process. And when we're thinking about transforming processes, one of the questions that I see fairly often is how you change those processes, whether you change them before you introduce technology, whether you, with the technology that you introduce, capture a lot of bad practice maybe from the past, or do you change your processes after you've brought the technology in? So if you have any thoughts on that, I think they can be very valuable.
I definitely do. This is a critical, great question, Peter. I think it's a really important area, and I've mentioned it already a little bit. If you look at, to me, the best way to bring in technology is to work through an as-is assessment of your existing, standard operating procedures and work instructions. Understand that across functions, across sites. Really catalog what you do today and be able to capture. I've got a really granular approach that I take on this stuff, because you go through that, you do a comparison site by site and across functions. You understand what the variances are in each one of the cases, right? You work your way through that. And then you can have a discussion first on the idea of standardizing, where you say, yes, we can actually do this all the same way. And here's how you kind of get to that discussion. You now have documented everything. One of the big problems you have in any company, any kind of change, is change reluctance, right? If you can document where you're coming from and you can prove, hey, here's why I think we can do this the same way. You're doing A, site B is doing B, right? But they're very similar. If we abstract that a little bit and we can then basically connect the processes, identify how we can make them similar enough that we can adapt them across the board, now you have the proof to overcome some of that change reluctance. So your first step is, how can we make it the same? The second step is, while we're working through that, how do we technology optimize this process? Given the technology we're bringing in, if you're coming into a scenario where every site's been doing it differently, now we can do it the same. We're also going to be able to compare information across sites. We're also going to be able to do ABC, right? There's other advantages to this technology implementation you're about to embark upon, right? So you work your way through that to technology optimize it, and then at that point, you provided a point of view, and you can assess your vendors, your potential partners, against the technology partners themselves, right? Against what you've come up with. I think you need to have that point of view. It's tough because I'd say a lot of people in quality have strong quality skills, but maybe not those technical skills we just talked about. In IT, they also don't have the quality skills. So it's a little bit difficult because you're trying to you need to have both of those to kind of work your way through that process. But the value of it is that you actually identify what you're trying to get to up front. And now, instead of just looking at, when you look to bring in a technology provider at this point, when you get to solution selection, instead of going out and saying, okay, who's got the best technology, you say, not only am I looking for the best technology, but who has the technology that's best aligned with the processes and configuration I'm looking for. So therefore, I can adapt them, I can implement them more quickly, right? And in the cases like life sciences organizations like pharmaceutical, medical devices, that also has a huge impact. Because from a regulatory standpoint, they've got to follow a lot of FDA requirements, and any change you make has to be fully validated. It's a huge effort. So there's a lot of this stuff that the more work you can do up front and then pick a partner and be flexible. They can probably, maybe they've better ways of doing it they came up with in-house. Or maybe there's other approaches. That's okay, but at least you have that documented perspective, and then you can iterate as you go through, but at least you're kind of at that spot where you've pulled the different information together and you have done the abstraction work to really connect all the dots. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think so. It seemed to me to say standardize on best practice within your organization, then go out and get and understand what the technology could do for you, and then go out and select a technology that will do that. That was kind of my understanding of what you said.
That's right. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
That's really clear, and I think is really good advice as well. And surprisingly, many organizations, I don't know if it's most, but many don't do it that way.
Right.
They do what you seem to be implying as being the wrong thing to do, which is they start by going out to a provider and saying, what does your technology do and how can we fit what we do around that?
Right. That's exactly what they do. And I think, to me, that's a bad decision, because at the end of the day, who is your best option? Probably the one who gets you to, you really, when I look at the process eventually is going to drive the value. And the technology provider is going to be the one who's going to help you automate that process. So you really want to be very process oriented, in my opinion, when you're looking through technology selections.
Okay, so you've made some changes, and perhaps you're in the process of making changes. Continuous improvement is something that a lot of organizations seem to be more interested in today. I started to get involved with it in the mid-'80s, and I thought, that it was a big thing then. But I now have gone back and looked at the statistics, what the research says, and it's basically that interest in continuous improvement has increased very steadily over the last 5 years or so, and is now at an all-time high. So I find this very interesting, but it does indicate that organizations are very interested in it today. How do you think they can do that better?
Yeah, I think you quoted Deming earlier, right? Well, let me go with another Deming quote that I love, which is, "In God we trust, all others bring data," right? I love that quote.
Absolutely. It's very important for the coronavirus too. But go ahead.
Absolutely. So if you look at that particular quote, right? I think we're in the middle right now. There's the opportunity to have much more data, but also metrics and insights. Right? So at the end of the day, there's the ability to mine insights where we didn't have that ability before. And I think that's what's driving the potential for continuous improvement. So back to your question on the process side too, right? Yeah, you implement this process. That's based off your best knowledge right now, right? Well, now if you're taking a metric-driven approach, like which are the metrics that are most important to you, right? You have to figure that out. And how do you measure it? Like, there's so many times I get into conversations around process improvements. I'm like, okay, what's the success measures for this change we're about to make? How are you going to measure success? And it comes back to those types of things too, right? You always say, what is the outcome we're looking for, and how are we going to measure that outcome, right? And so as you work through, you've got to be agile. You now have new data. You can drive new insights. It's a continual loop of data resulting in insights, resulting in, ideally, faster decision-making process that involves culturally multiple different teams, right? So they're all on board with this stuff, and then moving over through execution, and then a feedback loop back to the beginning. So you got to make your best stab the first time around. Now you're going to have new insights because you've got an automated system. It's going to start driving those insights, and now you loop your way through. And I think that's what's driving the continuous improvement stuff is that, first of all, there was, leading up to COVID, there's a significant focus on efficiencies, right? Everyone was heavily focused on driving increased efficiencies and reduced cost in a global supply chain. So that piece was one big driver for continuous improvement. The other part was the digital transformation. That's my opinion.
Absolutely. And as important as continuous improvement is, organizations are still facing roadblocks in their transformation. Some of them that you've mentioned, maybe silos, maybe replacement of jobs with robots, maybe just reluctance to change to a degree. What do you see as the biggest roadblocks that organizations need to get over?
With transformation in general?
Yes, I think so. But also maybe when the focus of this discussion is especially around quality.
Yeah.
So maybe with some reference to those too.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question too. So if we work our way through one piece, obviously, we talked briefly around change reluctance, right? And that can happen for practitioners, within quality. It can also happen for everyone else who's impacted by quality. You might be asking them to take on a new role, right? We talked about how this is everyone's responsibility. They might have to take on some new roles. How do you actually negotiate that? There's always negotiation anytime you get engaged in change, right? And you're going to involve a lot in transformation by definition. If you're doing it right, like we talked about, you're involving lots of cross-functional stakeholders. And so there's some negotiation with all that stuff. So that's one challenge, is just the change reluctance and the fact that if you're doing it properly, you're connecting with many different groups. A second piece, you brought up the business case earlier on. You actually, in quality, quality has, for many organizations, has not been the primary recipient of technology investment over years, like we've talked about. You actually need the ability to generate a long-term roadmap and executing that roadmap with funding over time. Basically, at the end of the day, you can transform processes and you can work on competency, but you're not going to get too far with technology without money. So we talked about this whole collaborative versus competitive environment. Money is basically always competitive. So when you think about this stuff, it's not just that people necessarily want to hand you money. You actually are fighting against, effectively, other priorities at all times. You need to get yourself prioritized high and keep that priority. And that's where building that business case is critical. And that's why it's such an important skill. Anybody who's been in business knows just how important that is. It's very true. So I think that's another challenge is basically feeding that long-term roadmap. And then the last piece again is we talked about the cross-functional piece, right? And if you look at technology initiatives, making sure the quality is tied in. Like if you're implementing Factory of the Future initiatives, if you're implementing your data lake initiatives, BI, machine learning, quality actually has to get tied in with lots of that stuff. We might not be the owner, but we are a stakeholder, in many of those different initiatives. So getting a seat at the table is very important. It can take some time to build that credibility.
Absolutely. So I just got two further things. The first is, we started to talk about COVID-19. It's having a big impact everywhere at the moment. What do you see as the operational impact to that, and how do you think it might impact quality management?
Yeah, that's okay. So one of the people that I follow a lot, Peter, I don't know if you've been doing this too, but like for me, I've been paying attention to the stock market like crazy. It's been exciting and devastating news at the same time recently. But if you look at one of the people that I trust a lot in that world is Mohammed El-Arian. So he was the CEO of PIMCO, which is one of the world's biggest bond funds, and now he's I think the chief economic advisor to Allianz, which is a really big financial firm, really sharp guy. His take's been that as we go forward with COVID, that in the world after COVID, is that in the past we were really heavily focused on efficient supply chains. But now it's going to be really around sustainability, right? And so agility and sustainability. So that's going to be a key go forward focus is how do you deal? You're going to actually, it's like an optimization problem. Anytime you're optimizing something, pre-COVID, we didn't have to worry about social distancing, right? Now you've got to bring that discussion in this new layer of safety considerations in your supply chain. And at the same time, there's a lot of politics around COVID. And that's going to likely have people pull some of their production, re-onshore that production, right? And that's going to impact your efficiency too. For the foreseeable, like next several years, we're going to have to work our way through the, re-onshoring, reskilling different personnel, and at the same time, increasing like both our agility and also taking some efficiency hits, right? So I think if you look at that from a quality standpoint, one other key point is that just yesterday they were talking about how Manhattan real estate is likely to get a bit of a reckoning, because a lot of firms that have a lot of real estate in Manhattan are likely to reduce their footprint and so whether or not that happens, these are all possible scenarios out there. But I think ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to see more of a virtual workforce over time. We're going to see and that necessitates, again, we keep talking about technology. I mean, that there's no way of overcoming that without having effective technology to virtualize that workforce and provide subject matter expertise. Let's say a plant in South Africa needs your expertise, Peter. You're much less likely to fly there now versus to provide virtual remote advice, right? So implementing things like remote operations centers and remote centers of excellence, those types of concepts, I think are much more likely, and that impacts quality just as much as it does supply chain. Investment in technology to help improve collaboration, especially from a distributed workforce that's less likely to be at a single location, and then connected worker applications that can help provide assurance of safety, as an example, I think is another one that likely will play a role.
Absolutely. I'm fascinated today by the acceleration of technology that the COVID has brought about. There are whole areas, both at work and in society more widely, that we're seeing greatly increased use of technology and a much quicker change than we were anticipating. Just as you mentioned, people working at home. In some ways you would have expected that to have happened more quickly anyway, because it's been possible for a long time. But now we've seen it really move, and that's going to change things a lot.
And I think people are wondering, why do I need to go back to an office? You still have the same efficiency remote. But then it comes down to if you're using paper, if you're using, very fragmented approaches, you need to overcome those problems.
And at the same time, as people thinking, why do I need to go back? You're going to have employers, some of them, saying, I didn't like the idea of this, of people working remotely, but it worked okay, and so why don't we just keep doing it?
Right? I think one note that I also missed, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but to me, one of the areas that is going to also change quality, we talked about the digital voice of the customer, and we also are saying, well, shoot, when you've online marketplaces, right, you've got this whole 5-star marketplace concept in reviews that actually is a gold mine of data, but can also significantly damage your ability to sell. Like, I don't know if you're like me, but when I'm looking through Amazon or Home Depot's website, right, I'm working my way through that. If it's not above 4 stars, I'm pretty much not buying it. Right? So you have to have that rating that's quite high. And there's a lot of tactics that companies provide to basically buy higher ratings also, right? So some of that stuff isn't all that truthful. But at the end of the day, that digital supply chain is going to be a huge impact on quality, because the visibility of your quality issues in those worlds versus a face-to-face world is even that much higher. It's so easy to write a great review or a scathing review, and that impacts your business. So I think that really even further casts a spotlight on how important quality is going to be for us going forward. So we need that agility, et cetera, but we also need to make sure we do that in a cost competitive way but also with very high quality. So I think it puts a lot of pressure on.
Yeah,
And thus, you
it
need the tech.
suggests potentially that there will be, a lot more pressure, as you're saying, for quality to be improved. We've already seen it in a number of areas where those reviews have been important, and what you're saying seems correct, that we're going to see more of that
Yeah,
in more areas. Absolutely.
yeah.
Okay, I've got one final question. We've talked for a long time, and it's been very interesting. But the last question I've got is that for students who are watching this, and they may now be very excited, I'm sure, about a career in quality, what advice would you give them today?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just in general, we've talked a lot about technology, right? I think we both see just how much impact that's had, and that's not going to slow down, right? So, but I think the area where a student can differentiate themselves, right, going forward is going to be really around having the subject matter expert combined with technology expertise. And so, I think if you've got the option to take some almost pure tech electives, like understanding how to data model, understanding how to value stream map, build swim lane diagrams, all that kind of stuff, build requirements, listen to the voice of the customer and convert that. Getting some of those understandings are actually pretty high value just in general. And if you look at the quality space, I think for someone coming out with the knowledge of the quality processes and tech, you've got some really, I think to me, it's a very exciting time. Um, this whole digital transformation we're seeing in manufacturing, in distribution, but starting with the voice of the customer has opened up, and it's created such a spotlight on quality and an opportunity for a forward thinker to drive some change. So if you're a big picture thinker, if you think maybe aggressively in a thought leadership kind of a format, you need to have the foundation of good subject matter expertise and good technology skills. But if you've got those two things, you can cast a really interesting vision and actually make it happen today. And it's gotten increasingly, you look at some of these tech providers, Peter, and we talked about this a little bit before too, tech has become so accessible, right? And the ability to do things like if you want to build something in a business process management tool, the big focus is low code, no code environments. You can make it happen. You can make it happen pretty quickly. So I think it's an exciting time, and I think from a quality professional's perspective, there's a lot of opportunity to really make quality a competitive asset for a company with the right mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. I think operations generally now is much more exciting than it was in the past. We're not simply thinking of how can we better manage what we do now. We're thinking about something that's changing very quickly, and where there are opportunities to be creative and to express your ideas and use all the skills that you've got in being able to make these things happen, which to me is the really interesting part of operations management and quality management as part of that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you raise a great point there too, because if you go think about it from an operations perspective, we talked about COVID's impact and likely bringing operations back onshoring. That's setting up new operations, right? Right there, there's an opportunity. Like how do we want to do that? Do we want to replicate what was there, or do we want to transform it, right? Can we bring this to the next level, right? And that's where I think in the next, this stuff doesn't happen for all the students watching. Speed of business is fast, but it's not that fast, right? Yeah. It's going to take some time, So when you get out there, there's going to be this transformation that's going to happen probably over the next 5 to 10 years, and lots of interesting opportunities.
Well, thank you for talking to me today, Dan. I've greatly enjoyed our discussion, and I know that the students will learn from it, and their careers will benefit from it. So. Thanks again for doing this.
Thanks, Peter. I really appreciate it. Good luck, everyone.